The vast, obsidian chamber of the High Synod sat suspended in the gravity well of the trinary star system, a monument to 100,000 years of uninterrupted order, a silence so profound that the shifting of tectonic plates on the planet below seemed louder than the breathing of the counselors. Here, the air was cold, recycled through filtration systems that had been scrubbing the atmosphere since before the first mammal crawled from the mud of a distant, blue world. And the light that filtered through the crystalline dome was fractured into spectrums of indigo and violet, casting long, skeletal shadows across the polished floor. It was a place of absolute certainty, where the fates of star systems were decided not with passion or fervor, but with the cold, mathematical precision of the Krellian ascendancy, a species that had long ago discarded the messy inefficiencies of emotion in favor of the pristine logic of the aggregate. High Justicar Vral sat upon the central dais, his chitinous carapace dull with the patina of 4 centuries of governance, his compound eyes reflecting the myriad streams of data that cascaded down the holographic pillars surrounding the throne, watching the slow, rhythmic pulse of the Empire's heartbeat, until a singular, discordant note shattered the symphony of their perfect silence. It was not a sound, for there was no sound in the void but a sensor ghost, a bleed of thermal energy that should not have existed, a reading so violent and raw that it caused the data streams to flicker and recoil as if in physical pain. Vral shifted, the sound of his armored joints grinding together echoing like thunder in the hush, and he looked toward the strategy cast, his mandibles clicking in a language of subtle vibrations that indicated mild annoyance rather than genuine concern. The anomaly was located in the 9th quadrant, a region of space designated as the null zone, a graveyard of dead stars and intense radiation where the fabric of reality was thin and treacherous, a place forbidden by the ancient edicts, the place where they had cast the impurities of the galaxy to wither and die. The censor officer, a younger Krellian named Kalen whose shell was still bright and unscarred, trembled as he manipulated the interface, his movements frantic, betraying a fear that was unbecoming of his station, a fear that rippled through the gathered counselors as the image resolved itself on the central viewing sphere. It was a ship, or what remained of one, a jagged splinter of metal and ceramic that defied all aerodynamic logic, a vessel that looked less like a machine and more like a wound in the cosmos, tearing through the vacuum at velocities that should have reduced it to atomic dust. It was trailing a wake of exotic particles, a burning shroud of ionization that glowed with a malevolent, white-hot intensity, scorching the sensors that tried to track it, a celestial comet of artificial origin that was screaming across the dark toward the sanctity of the Synod. "Impossible," Vral intoned, the word heavy with the weight of dogma, for the archives stated clearly that nothing returned from the null zone, that the radiation and the gravitational shears were absolute, a barrier that no shield modulation could withstand, and yet the object was there, burning, accelerating, defying the entropy that claimed all things. The counselors murmured, a low buzzing sound of rising panic, for they recognized the thermal signature, the crude but potent fusion drive, the brutalist architecture of the hull that favored durability over elegance. It was a design they had not seen in 3 cycles, not since the Great Purge, not since the day they had gathered in this very chamber to pass judgment on a young, reckless species that had refused to kneel. It was a Terran vessel. The realization hit the chamber like a physical blow, stripping away the veneer of calm superiority. For the Terrans were supposed to be dead, extinguished, their memory erased from the galactic record as a warning to any who would dare to question the Ascendancy's stagnation. They had been exiled, their fleet broken, their homeworld embargoed, and their survivors driven into the null zone with a single battered cruiser to lead them into the dark, a mercy killing in the guise of banishment. But they had returned, or at least one had. The ship was identified by the archaic transponder codes that flickered through the static of the interference, the Prometheus Unbound. Vral remembered the name, for he had been a junior actuary during the trial, and he remembered the human captain who had stood before them then, a creature of soft flesh and fragile bone who had spoken of curiosity and exploration with a fire that the Krellian logic could not extinguish. They had banished him for his insolence, for the human refusal to accept the boundaries of safe space, for their reckless tinkering with technologies that the Ascendancy deemed heretical. And no. The Prometheus was back, but it was not the gleaming vessel of exploration that had left. It was a ruin, a flying catastrophe, its hull plated with makeshift armor harvested from the carcasses of other ships, its engines venting plasma in uncontrolled bursts, its entire structure glowing with the residual heat of a journey that should have taken 1,000 years. It was coming in hot, burning through the outer defense perimeter without checking its velocity, ignoring the automated hail warnings, ignoring the gravity buoys, a singular, unstoppable force directed straight at the heart of the Synod. "Intercept it," the War Master clicked, his voice harsh, overriding the stunned silence. "It is a kinetic weapon. They have turned their tomb into a missile. They seek vengeance for the exile. Destroy it before it breaches the inner sanctuary." The logic was sound, undeniably so. A vessel moving at such speed, radiating such instability, was a threat to the station's integrity, and the humans had every reason to hate the Ascendancy, every reason to spend their last breath in a suicide strike against the architects of their doom. The defense grid activated, the orbital lances tracking the burning streak, charging the antimatter beams that would vaporize the intruder, turning the ship into a cloud of expanding gas. Vral watched the targeting reticles lock on, his finger hovering over the authorization rune, but something stayed his hand, a hesitation that was alien to his nature, a curiosity that sparked in the dormant centers of his mind. Why transmit? Why broadcast a transponder code if the intent was simple destruction? A kinetic kill vehicle required stealth, not a screaming announcement of identity. The ship was not hiding, it was shouting. "Hold fire," Vral commanded, his voice echoing from the dais, shocking the War Master into stillness. "Scan the energy signature again, look at the wake. It is not just propulsion, it is leakage." Kalen, the sensor officer, expanded the data, his eyes widening as the telemetry poured in. "High Justicar," he whispered, the vibration of his voice trembling. "The radiation levels are off the scale. The ship is not just burning from friction. It is burning from the inside. The reactor is critical. They are not attacking. They are breaching containment. If we fire upon them, the explosion will be—" He struggled for the word, his mind unable to encompass the magnitude. "Cataclysmic. The antimatter containment on that ship is failing. If we shatter the hull, we release the core. It would scour the atmosphere from the planet below." The silence that followed was absolute, a cold realization that they were held hostage not by a weapon, but by a tragedy. The human ship was a flying bomb, yes, but one that required a gentle hand, not a hammer. The Prometheus screamed past the outer markers, the visual feeds showing the hull plating buckling under the stress, pieces of the superstructure tearing away and disintegrating in the ion trail. It was a dying ship, piloted by the dead, a ghost returning to haunt the living. "Open a channel," Vral ordered, though the protocol dictated that exiles were to be silenced, not heard. "If they are to detonate, I wish to know why they chose to die here." Communications array whined as it tried to pierce the veil of radiation surrounding the human vessel, the static crying out like a wounded animal, until abruptly the noise cut out, replaced by a clarity that was almost unnatural. The holographic emitter in the center of the council chamber flickered and resolved into a human face, but not the one Vral remembered. The captain from the trial had been young, vibrant, full of righteous anger. This man was a ruin, a reflection of his ship. His skin was pale, translucent, mapped with the blue veins of radiation sickness. His eyes sunken into dark pits. His hair gone, replaced by scarring that suggested he had looked into the heart of a star without blinking. He sat in a command chair that seemed to be holding him together, tubes and wires running from the bulkhead directly into his chest, sustaining a heartbeat that should have stopped long ago. "This is Captain Elias Thorne of the Prometheus," the human rasped, his voice dry, lacking the aggression the council expected. He did not sound like an avenging demon. He sounded like a man who had carried a mountain across a desert. "Do not fire, we are not hostile, we are returning." The War Master stepped forward, his mandibles flaring. "You were banished," he roared, his translation collar struggling to convey the depth of his outrage. "You were cast into the null zone for crimes against the stability. You have returned in violation of the edict. You threaten the Synod with your instability. Why should we not vaporize you and accept the collateral damage as the price of order?" Thorne looked at the War Master, and for a moment, a ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips, a smile so devoid of humor and filled with pity that it chilled Vral to his core. "Because," Thorne said softly, "if you destroy us, you destroy the warning, and if you miss the warning, you will not have time to be afraid." "Warning?" Vral asked, leaning forward, the ancient joints of his exoskeleton protesting. "The null zone is empty. It is a void. There is nothing there but dust and silence. What warning could you possibly bring from the grave?" Thorne coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sprayed blood onto the camera lens, which he wiped away with a trembling hand. "It is not empty," he whispered. We thought it was empty too. We thought you exiled us to die in the cold, but you didn't. You exiled us to the front line. You didn't know you were arrogant, but you didn't know. The ship shuddered on the screen, sparks showering down around the human captain as a bulkhead gave way somewhere in the distance. We found something, or it found us. We have been running for, God, I don't know how long. Time is wrong out there. We have been burning the engines at 300% for a decade, maybe more. We burned the furniture, we burned the bulkheads, we burned the archives. We are burning the shield generator now. We came back to tell you. Tell us what? Kalen asked, his voice cutting through the tension, his curiosity overriding his fear. What is in the null zone? Thorn looked directly into the camera, his eyes seemingly locking onto Vral's, bridging the distance of vacuum and species. The silence, Thorn said. The silence is not an absence of noise. It is a predator. It is a frequency, a hunger, and it is waking up. The transmission distorted, the image tearing as the Prometheus hit the upper atmosphere of the gas giant orbiting the station, using the friction to brake. A maneuver so suicidal that the flight computers of the Krellian fleet flagged it as a crash. The ship was a fireball now, a streak of burning plasma diving into the gravity well, skipping off the atmosphere like a stone, shedding momentum in violent, shuddering distinct drops until it drifted, smoldering and broken, into the docking cradle of the Synod's lower ring. The clamps engaged with a metallic scream, the station shuddering under the impact of the mass. Quarantine, the science cast leader hissed. Biological containment, if they have brought a pathogen. Vral silenced him with a raised hand. No, if they wanted to kill us, they could have let the reactor breach. They are keeping it stable, just barely. I will go. The council erupted in protest, but Vral was the high justicar, and his word was the final iteration of the law. He descended from the dais, his retinue scrambling to follow, moving toward the airlock that connected the pristine sanctity of the station to the burning ruin of the human ship. The airlock cycled, the hiss of decontamination gases filling the corridor, and then the heavy blast doors ground open. The smell hit them first, ozone, melted copper, burnt flesh, and the metallic tang of recycled air that had been breathed too many times. The interior of the Prometheus was a nightmare of engineering. Cables hung like entrails from the ceiling, sparking fitfully. The floor was hot to the touch through Vral's boots, and the walls were covered in scrawlings, mathematical formulas, star charts, and desperate prayers written in marker, paint, and blood. They found Thorn in the bridge, still strapped to the command chair, the life support systems wheezing around him. He was alone. The bridge was empty of other crew. Where are the others? Vral asked, his voice filtered through his helmet, stepping over a pile of debris. Thorn opened his eyes, which were milky now, blind or nearly so. Gone, he rasped. Stasis failed 3 years ago, or maybe 5. Power diverted to the engines. They chose it. They voted. One ship had to make it back. One crew had to keep the fire burning. He gestured weakly to the main console. The data, it's all there, the coordinates, the frequency, the arrival time. Vral moved to the console, plugging his interface jack into the crude human port. The data flooded his mind, a torrent of information that made his optic nerves ache. He saw what the humans had seen. The null zone was not a natural phenomenon. It was a camouflage field, a dampening shroud erected eons ago to hide the galaxy from something outside, something that dwelled in the intergalactic void. And the Krellian ascendancy, in their arrogance, had cast the humans through the veil, breaking the camouflage, attracting the attention of the things that watched. You woke it up, Vral whispered, horror dawning on him. Your presence there, the vibrations of your engines. You woke the hunter. Thorn laughed, a dry, cracking sound. No, it was already awake. It was eating the rim stars. We didn't wake it. We distracted it. We led it on a chase. We made ourselves the prey. The human coughed again, his body seizing. We realized why you exiled us. You thought we were dangerous, unpredictable. You were right. We are. That's why we survived. That's why we could run. Vral looked at the data again. The entity, a swarm of self-replicating nanophagic machines the size of moons, was tracking the Prometheus. It was following the thermal trail. The burning of the ship was not just damage. It was a lure. You brought it here, the War Master shrieked, raising his weapon. You led the Devourer to our doorstep. I led it to the trap, Thorn whispered, his head lolling back. I didn't come back to beg for sanctuary. I came back to open the door. The station rocked violently. The sensors in the council chamber above screamed a new warning. A rift was opening at the edge of the system, tearing the fabric of spacetime. But it was not the Devourer. It was not the cold, mechanical swarm that Vral had seen in the data files. It was a fleet, a human fleet. Hundreds of ships, not broken and burning like the Prometheus, but armored in obsidian and chrome, bristling with weaponry that defied Krellian physics, engines pulsing with the power of harness singularities. The Prometheus had not been the survivor, it had been the scout. The banished had not died in the dark, they had conquered it. They had found the resources in the null zone, the derelict technologies of the precursor races who had built the Veil, and they had adapted, evolved, and rebuilt their civilization in the harsh crucible of the void. Thorn looked up, his blind eyes seeing something Vral could not. "We knew you wouldn't listen," he said, his voice fading. "We knew the Ascendancy was too proud to believe a warning from an exile, so we had to show you. I had to show you." The floor beneath them vibrated as the incoming fleet hailed the station. The voice that boomed over the general frequency was not weak like Thorn's. It was commanded, ironclad, the voice of an admiral who commanded armada born in hell. "This is Admiral Vance of the Terran Dominion," the voice thundered. "We have tracked the swarm to this sector. We are engaging. Krellian command, lower your shields and synchronize your targeting data with ours or get out of the way. We are not here to invade. We are here to finish the war you started by throwing us to the wolves." Vral stood frozen, looking from the dying man in the chair to the tactical display where the Terran fleet was deploying into a combat formation that was geometrically perfect, a wall of fire and steel positioned between the Ascendancy and the dark. The burning of the Prometheus had been a beacon, yes, but a beacon for the cavalry, not the enemy. Thorn had burned his ship, his crew, and his own life to create a thermal signature distinct enough to guide the fleet through the treacherous interference of the null zone. He was the lighthouse keeper who set himself on fire to guide the ships home. "Why?" Vral asked, the question slipping out, stripped of all political pretense. "We exiled you, we condemned you, we fired on you when you tried to return. Why save us? Why not let the swarm consume the Ascendancy and rule over the ashes?" Thorn's breathing was shallow, the pauses between breaths growing longer. "Because," he whispered, "humans. We don't leave people behind, even the ones who left us." The medical teams arrived then, swarming the bridge, but Vral waved them back. It was too late, and he sensed that Thorn knew it. The captain's job was done. The Prometheus had delivered its cargo. The ship groaned, the reactor finally stabilizing as the remote links from the arrival fleet took over the cooling systems, but the captain was cooling in a different way. Vral placed a hand on the human's shoulder, a gesture of intimacy that was forbidden between castes, let alone species. "You came back burning," Vral said softly, "and you have set the sky on fire." Thorn died as the first lances of light exchanged fire in the void, the Terran fleet engaging the vanguard of the swarm that had followed the Prometheus out of the dark. The battle that ensued was not a skirmish. It was a revelation. The Krellian counselors watched in stunned silence as the human ships maneuvered with a reckless, terrifying grace, their weapons tearing through the enemy biological machines with a ferocity that the logical minds of the Ascendancy could not quantify. The humans fought not with the detached precision of the Krellians, but with a passionate, chaotic fury ramming enemy vessels when their cannons failed, detonating warp cores to create gravity wells, using the debris of the battlefield as shields. They were illogical, unpredictable, and utterly magnificent. Hours later, or perhaps days, time had lost its meaning in the viewing chamber. The immediate threat was neutralized. The swarm vanguard was reduced to drifting slag. The Terran flagship, the Event Horizon, docked with the Synod. Admiral Vance marched into the council chamber, flanked by soldiers in power armor that look. Like it had been forged from the hull of a star. They did not bow. They did not ask for permission to speak. Vance stood before the high Justicar, her face scarred, her eyes hard. She held a helmet under her arm, the air of the chamber tasting stale compared to the ozone clinging to her suit. "The swarm is not defeated," she said, her voice echoing off the high, crystalline ceiling. "That was a hunting party. The main body is months behind. We have bought you time. We have bought us all time." She looked around the chamber at the terrified, awestruck faces of the alien counselors who had once signed her species' death warrant. "We have established a perimeter at the edge of the null zone. We call it the Aegis Line. We are holding the dark back, but we cannot do it alone. We have the ships, we have the weapons, and we have the will. But we do not have the infrastructure. We need your shipyards. We need your resources. We need your logistics." It was a demand, not a request, but it was also an offer of salvation. Vral looked at the Admiral, and then he looked at the empty chair where Thorn had appeared on the screen. The logic of the Ascendancy dictated that a threat should be eliminated, but the logic had failed. The universe was not a safe, orderly equation. It was a chaotic, hungry dark, and the only thing standing between the order and the entropy was the fire of the human spirit. The humans had been the variable they had tried to remove, and in doing so, they had forged the weapon that would save them. We accept, Vral said, his voice trembling slightly. The Ascendancy apologizes. We were incorrect. Vance's expression softened just a fraction. We didn't come back for an apology, Justicar. We came back because this is our galaxy too, and we're not done with it yet. She turned to look out the viewport where the wreckage of the Prometheus was being towed into a shipyard bay, a charred, broken husk that was now the most sacred relic in the system. Captain Thorne, she said, quietly enough that only Vral heard. He was the best of us. He held the throttle open until his bones burned. Honor him. We will, Vral promised, and he meant it. The months that followed were a blur of unprecedented activity. The rigid caste system of the Krellian society began to fracture under the necessity of war. Humans and aliens worked side by side in the orbital foundries, retrofitting the elegant, fragile Krellian ships with the brutal, redundant armor of the Terran design. Cultural exchanges happened not in diplomatic halls, but in mess halls and engine rooms. The aliens learned that humans were loud, abrasive, emotional, and prone to extreme risks, but they also learned that humans were loyal to a fault, creative in the face of impossibility, and possessed of a humor that could find light in the darkest trench. The humans, in turn, learned that the Krellians were not just cold bureaucrats. They were masters of efficiency, their minds capable of processing logistical data that would drive a human computer insane. The two species, once separated by exile and arrogance, fit together like two halves of a broken key. The burning that the title of the saga would later refer to became a metaphor for the industrial output of the combined civilization. The forges never went cold. The shipyards burned with the light of welding torches day and night. The Prometheus was not repaired. It was encased in a sphere of transparent aluminum and placed in the central plaza of the new Unity station, a monument to the price of survival. The legend of the man who came back burning spread through the fleets, a mythic figure who had outrun death to warn the living. But the true test was yet to come. The swarm, as Vance had predicted, arrived not as a trickle, but as a flood. They blackened the stars at the edge of the system, a tide of metal and hunger that sought to consume all organic life. The Battle of the Aegis Line would go down in history as the single greatest conflict in recorded time. The Krellian fleets, commanded by the Terran strategies, held the center. The Terran dreadnoughts, supported by Krellian electronic warfare suites, took the flanks. It was a symphony of destruction. Vral, observing from the war room, watched the tactical map with a sense of detachment that was slowly being replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating emotion. Hope. He saw a Terran cruiser, its engines flaring, dive into the heart of a swarm cluster, detonating its core to break the enemy formation, a maneuver that was mathematically unsound but strategically brilliant. He saw Krellian frigates shielding damaged human fighters, sacrificing their pristine hulls to save the chaotic pilots. He saw unity. In the final hours of the battle, when the swarm's Leviathan-class command ship breached the perimeter, it was the Event Horizon that moved to intercept. Admiral Vance's voice came over the comms, calm and icy. All hands B. Race for impact. We are going to shove this dreadnought down their throat. The Terran flagship accelerated, its burning drive mirroring the desperate run of the Prometheus months earlier. But this time it was not alone. A dozen Krellian heavy cruisers moved with it, locking their tractor beams onto the human ship not to stop it, but to add their thrust to its momentum. They became a spear, a multi-species projectile of impossible mass. They struck the swarm Leviathan with the force of a small supernova. The explosion lit up the dark side of the planet below, a second dawn that lasted for minutes. When the light faded, the Leviathan was broken, its command structure shattered, the swarm falling into confusion and disarray, easily mopped up by the remaining fleet. Silence returned to the High Synod, but it was not the cold, sterile silence of before. It was a heavy, exhausted silence, the silence of survivors catching their breath. Vral stood on the dais, looking at the reports. The cost had been high, millions dead. The Event Horizon was gone, but the galaxy was safe. The banishment was over. The exile had ended not with a whimper, but with a roar that had shaken the pillars of heaven. Years later, a statue would be unveiled in the center of the capital. It depicted not a Krellian nor a human, but a ship wreathed in sculpted flames, breaking through a wall of stone. The inscription at the base was written in both the precise geometric script of the Krell and the blocky, rugged alphabet of Terra. It did not list the names of the dead, for there were too many. It simply read, "They banished him to the dark. He returned as the light, and in his burning we found our way." Vral, now the oldest living Krellian, retired from the High Synod that day. He walked through the crowd of mixed species, watching a young human child playing with a Krellian larvae, showing it how to throw a ball. The Krellian child caught it with clumsy mandibles, and the human laughed, a bright, uninhibited sound. Vral stopped and looked up at the stars, no longer fearing the void, no longer seeking to hide behind veils or edicts. The universe was still dangerous, yes. The dark was still deep. But they were no longer afraid of the burning. They had learned that sometimes, to survive the night, you have to be the one who brings the fire. The old Justicar touched the piece of jagged metal he carried in his robes, a fragment of the Prometheus hull he had kept since that first day. It was still warm, or perhaps that was just his imagination. He smiled, a gesture he had learned from his new friends, and whispered into the wind of a free world. "Welcome home." The galaxy turned, indifferent as always, but on this small, scarred world and the ring of steel that orbited it, there was a new warmth. The Krellian ascendancy was gone, replaced by something stronger, something messier, something born of the fusion of logic and passion. The Terran-Krellian alliance stood as the guardians of the gate, the watchers on the wall. And deep in the archives, in the section reserved for the greatest heroes, the file on Captain Elias Thorne remained open, the final entry simply stating, "Status, active. The fire still burns." As the sun set, casting long shadows across the plaza, the navigational lights of the orbital shipyards flickered on, 1,000 new stars in the sky, ready to carry the next generation into the unknown. They would not be exiles, they would be explorers, and if they found monsters in the dark, they would not run. They would burn. This was the legacy of the ship that returned. It taught a stagnant empire that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of the will to fight for it. It taught them that a single spark, nurtured in the cold breath of the void, can ignite a fire that consumes empires and forges alliances. It was the story of the one who was cast out, and the many who were saved because he refused to stay away. It was the story of the burning. And in the quiet humming of the new age, if one listened closely to the background radiation of the sector, beneath the chatter of trade routes and the songs of diplomacy, one could almost hear the faint, ghostly echo of a fusion drive pushed beyond its limits. A rhythmic, defiant heartbeat in the static. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. I am here, I am here. I am still burning. The Justicar closed his eyes, finally at peace, and let the sound wash over him. The long night was over. The dawn had come, and it was glorious. The sensory memory of that day remained etched in Vral's neural pathways with a fidelity that biological aging could not degrade. He remembered the specific oscillation of the deck plates as the Prometheus was towed into the bay, a vibration that felt like the shuddering of a dying beast. He remembered the smell of the human captain's blood, iron and salt, so primitive, yet so vital. But most of all, he remembered the shift in the collective PS. Each of his people. It was not instantaneous. The Krellian mind was not built for rapid paradigm shifts. It was a slow, grinding tectonic movement, a painful restructuring of their reality. In the weeks following the arrival of the Terran fleet and the subsequent repulsion of the swarm's vanguard, the High Synod had become a battleground of philosophy. The traditionalist caste argued that the alliance was a temporary necessity, a deal with the devil that should be discarded the moment the threat was neutralized. They pointed to the chaotic nature of human society, their messy democracy, their proneness to internal conflict, their terrifying art which depicted war not as a failure of logic, but as a tragic glory. "They are a virus," High Counselor Zal had argued during a closed session, his carapace flushing with the dark purple of agitation. "We exiled them because they were unstable. They have returned more unstable, more dangerous. They have weaponized the void itself. How long before they turn that fire upon us?" Vral had stood then, feeling the weight of the fragment of the Prometheus in his pocket. "They did not turn it upon us," he had countered, his voice calm, leveraging the immense capital of prestige he had gained by being the one to open the door. "They turned it for us. You speak of instability, Zal, but look at the data. Their instability is adaptability. Their chaos is nonlinear tactical thinking. We have stagnated. We build walls. They build bridges, even if they have to build them out of fire. If we discard them now, we do not just lose an ally, we lose the future." The debate had raged for a cycle, but the reality of the situation ended it. The swarm was not a theoretical threat. It was a mathematical certainty. The Terran Admiral Vance had shared their star charts, maps of the sectors the humans had traversed in the null zone. They were graveyards, entire systems stripped of all organic matter, stars surrounded by Dyson swarms of predatory machines that harvested their output to build more hunter-killers. The Krellian analysts had run the simulations 1,000 times, and the result was always the same. Without the Terrans, the ascendancy falls in 6 months. With the Terrans, the probability of survival rose to 42%. It was not a guarantee, but it was a chance. And for a species that dealt in absolutes, a 42% chance of survival was infinitely better than a 100% certainty of extinction. The integration began. It was a friction-heavy process. Krellian engineers, accustomed to silence and sterility, found themselves working alongside human mechanics who blasted rock and roll music, a cacophony of rhythmic screaming, while welding hull plates with plasma torches. Initially, the Krellians filed thousands of complaints about noise pollution and safety violations. But then, during a hull breach simulation on the shipyard docks, a Krellian lifter malfunctioned, pinning a worker beneath a 10-ton strut. The Krellian protocols dictated a pause to calculate the safest leverage point, a process that would have taken 3 minutes. The human mechanics didn't calculate. They swarmed. 10 of them wearing exosuits rushed in, straining the hydraulics of their gear to the breaking point, cursing and shouting, heaving the strut up by sheer brute force and adrenaline. The Krellian worker was saved. The complaints stopped. The music continued. Vral spent much of his time with Admiral Vance. She was a fascinating study in contradictions. She was a warrior who hated war. She commanded a fleet of planet killers but spent her free time cultivating a garden of Terran plants in the hydroponics bay of the Unity. Tomatoes, she had explained to Vral one evening, showing him a red, globular fruit. They require constant attention. Too much water, they rot. Too little, they wither. They are like peace, Justicar. You can't just decree it. You have to grow it. Vral had tasted the fruit. It was acidic, bursting with flavor, shocking to his palate, which was used to nutrient paste. It tasted like the human spirit, intense, messy, and undeniable. Speak of the burning, Vance said, looking out at the stars. Captain Thorne, he didn't just burn the ship, he burned his soul. You know what it's like in the null zone, Vral? It's not just dark, it's wrong. The geometry doesn't add up. You hear voices in the calm, static voices of your dead, the crew of the Prometheus. They started to break, mutinies, suicides. Thorne held them together. He became a tyrant to save them. He forced them to work, forced them to eat, forced them to live. He took all their hate, all their fear, and he absorbed it. By the time they reached your perimeter, he wasn't a man anymore. He was a vessel of pure will. That's why he looked that way. It wasn't just radiation. It was the cost of carrying a civilization's hope through hell. Vral had remained silent, processing this. The Krellian concept of leadership was based on consensus. An algorithm. The idea of a singular individual absorbing the collective trauma of a group was alien, yet strangely compelling. It explained the burning in a new light. It was not just physical combustion, it was spiritual consumption. Thorne had consumed himself to fuel the journey. As the months turned into a year, the preparations for the final confrontation with the main swarm body reached a fever pitch. The Aegis line became a fortress of stellar proportions. Asteroids were towed into position and hollowed out to serve as gun batteries. Minefields of antimatter charges were sown in the hyperspace lanes. The combined fleet, now painting their hulls with a unified sigil, a Krellian geometric circle intertwined with a Terran phoenix, drilled tirelessly. And then the signals came. The deep space buoys, the furthest eyes of the Alliance, went dark one by one. The silence of the void was replaced by the roar of the swarm. They came not as a fleet, but as a celestial event, a cloud of ships so dense it blotted out the stars behind it. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They simply advanced, a wall of entropy seeking to scour the life from the galaxy. The battle began on the edge of the Uit cloud. It was a meat grinder. The Krellian ships with their superior shields formed the anvil. The Terran ships with their devastating kinetic weaponry formed the hammer. They smashed the swarm vessels between them, filling the void with expanding gases and shattered metal. But for every swarm ship they destroyed, 2 more took its place. The enemy was adaptable, learning from every engagement. They started to jam the Krellian targeting sensors. They developed bioacids that ate through Terran armor. The line began to buckle. We are losing containment on Sector 7, Kalen, now the fleet coordinator, reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. The swarm is bypassing the minefields. They are heading for the orbital habitats. Vance's voice cut through the comms. Hold the line. Reroute power from the habitat shields to the orbital cannons. We have to break their momentum. But the civilians, A Krellian counselor protested. "If we lose the line, the civilians are dead anyway," Vance snapped. "Trust me, we are baiting them." Vral watched as the Terran strategy unfolded. It was terrifying. They were allowing the swarm to penetrate the defenses, creating a pocket, a kill box. It went against every Krellian instinct to yield territory, but Vral stayed his hand. "Let them work," he ordered the council. "Follow the Admiral's lead." The swarm poured into the gap, thinking they had found a weakness. They rushed toward the habitats, abandoning their defensive formations. And then the trap sprung. The civilians in the habitats had been evacuated days ago. The habitats were filled not with people, but with nukes. Thousands of gigatons of yield. "Ignite," Vance commanded. The explosion was silent in the vacuum, but the blinding flash overloaded optical sensors across half the system. The habitats vaporized, taking the core of the swarm assault force with them. It was a brutal, sacrificial move. The Krellians were horrified by the waste of infrastructure. The humans cheered. It was the difference in their natures. The Krellians mourned the loss of the structure. The humans celebrated the survival of the essence. With the swarm's center broken, the counterattack began. The Event Horizon led the charge, as described in the histories, but the details were far more visceral than any statue could convey. The ship was taking heavy fire, venting atmosphere, its hull glowing cherry red. Admiral Vance was broadcasting on all channels, her voice a rallying cry that transcended the translator software. She quoted ancient Terran poetry. She shouted insults at the cosmic horror. She laughed in the face of death. And the Krellians, caught up in the madness, found themselves roaring back. When the Leviathan fell, crashing into the gas giant in a storm of fire, the psychic scream of the swarm's hive mind dying was felt by every telepathic sensitive in the fleet. It was a sound of confusion, of fear. The predator had become the prey. The aftermath was a graveyard, but it was our graveyard. The debris fields were thick with the dead of two species, intermingled in the final cold embrace of the void. Salvage crews found Krellian escape pods tethered to Terran fighters, sharing life support. They found human Marines dead back-to-back with Krellian shock troopers, surrounded by piles of enemy husks. They had died together so that the galaxy could live. The rebuilding was slow. The political integration was even slower. There were factions on both sides that wanted to return to the old ways, to the isolation. But the burning had changed everything. The youth of the Krellian ascendancy, who had grown up watching the Terran fleets, no longer wanted the quiet life of the aggregate. They wanted to explore. They wanted to feel. They began to paint their carapaces with individual designs, a shocking break from tradition. They began to ask why, instead of how. And the humans found peace. For the first time in their history, they were not fighting themselves. They had found a purpose worthy of their intensity. They became the guardians, the teachers, the explorers. They took the Krellian logic and sharpened it. The Krellians took the human passion and stabilized it. Vral's retirement was not an end, but a beginning. He spent his remaining years writing the Chronicles of the Exile, a comprehensive history of the war and the events leading up to it. He interviewed the survivors of the Prometheus crew who had been revived from the failing stasis pods. He learned of their journey through the null zone, the years of darkness, the encroaching madness, the way Captain Thorne had sat in the chair day after day, refusing to sleep, refusing to let the hope die. One interview stood out, a young engineer named Sarah who had lost her arm in the initial breach. "He didn't speak much towards the end," she told Vral, her prosthetic hand whirring as she gestured. "He just watched the screens. We asked him why he was so sure the Krellians wouldn't just shoot us down. He said, because they are logical, and logically they have to know they're lonely. He bet everything on your capacity to change, Justicar. He bet his life that you were better than you pretended to be." Vral had wept then, a strange, heaving sensation in his chest that he had never experienced before. He had been right. Thorne had seen the potential in the Krellian soul that the Krellians themselves had forgotten. The story ends, as all stories do, with the passage of time. The statue in the plaza weathered, the bronze turning green, the stone smoothing under the touch of countless pilgrims. The Krellian ascendancy faded into history, replaced by the Galactic Union. The null zone was mapped, the monsters hunted to extinction or driven back into the intergalactic gulf. The burning trail of the Prometheus became a trade lane, the Thorne Hyperway, the safest and fastest route between the core worlds and the Rim. But on the anniversary of the return, every ship in the Union, from the massive dreadnoughts to the smallest shuttles, would perform the burn. For 1 minute, they would flare their engines to maximum output, turning the galaxy into a sea of lights, a man-made constellation of remembrance. It was a warning to the dark, we are here. It was a promise to the dead, We remember, and it was a thank you to the exile who came back burning. In the final moments of his life, Vral lay in a hospital bed overlooking the plaza. The ceremony was beginning. The sky turned white with the flare of a million engines. He felt the vibration in his bones, the familiar hum of power and defiance. He closed his eyes, and in the bright darkness behind his eyelids, he saw the Prometheus again, not as a wreck, but as a star. And he saw Thorn, whole and smiling, extending a hand. "Ready to go, Justicar?" the Phantom asked. Vral smiled, his spirit lightening, the weight of centuries falling away. Yes, he thought, let's burn. And so the last witness to the return passed into the history he had helped write, leaving behind a galaxy that burned not with the fires of war, but with the unquenchable light of unity. The ship had returned. The banishment was over, and the stars would never be silent again.